The doors are closed. Yes. Welcome, everybody. As you can hear, my voice is a little bit off the rails. I guess maybe some of our panelists have the same problem after the fantastic concert yesterday that we all witnessed. But this is a very good panel that I have been looking forward to moderate. We have a fantastic panel with us, and we're going to discuss criminal networks. We all have them, but they do look different. They do operate differently in our countries. Hopefully, we will, through our panelists, see some patterns, see how we could penetrate, so to say, those networks and learn more about them, while at the same time being safe. So, I'm going to present the panel. It's Julia Rubino and Cecilia Anesi. You are the co-founder of the IRP in Italy, and you're with KRIK. You guys are the ones who get calls from the mafia now and then. Good for you. Yassin, Musharbash, you are the deputy editor of the Zeit. Only of the investigative unit of the Zeit. Greenaway, you are a former FBI agent and supervisor. We are lucky to have you here as well. And Stevan Dojcinovic, you are the editor of KRIK. You also work with OCCRP, covering criminals in the Balkans mostly. Yeah? Right. Welcome all of you guys. I'm going to give you a few minutes each and just to talk about one of the last jobs that you guys have done. All right, I'm going to begin with you guys. Go ahead. You had some slides. I'm going to start as well.
Yeah. Shall we? No, I got it. Well, I'm only for the first, right? So. So this one and the next one. Okay. All right. How do I do that? Like this? I'm super bad at this. Sorry. Okay. So, hello. My name is Julia Rubino. I'm an investigative journalist at KRIK and also part of IRP, Italian Center for Investigative Reporting. And together with Cecilia, we have been working since 2011, 2012. On Italian organized crime, one of the most famous groups of organized crime, because there's not only one, of course, and they've been very fluid over the years, changing their importance. Like, do I have to go forward? Maybe I have. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. You probably know already all of this. Those are probably the most important groups. The ones at the far ends are not as relevant, probably, or not as rich, at least, as the ones in the middle. Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian Mafia, has been for a long time the most powerful and famous, but in the 90s, the Calabrians definitely took over in power and relevance and importance, especially because they managed to take control of the drug trade that has been enhancing exponentially their power, their reach, and their global presence. Most of our mafia started with local crime, and they, you know, as you probably seen in a lot of movies, they were very wise with their money. They put it aside and invested it in further criminal activities. That's what makes them organized. And they managed to enlarge their profits and their reach, and they become extremely powerful. The key to their power is like they're out of the windows. The reason why they are so hard to stop is because their criminal activities rest on the structures of our modern capitalist society. It's impossible to stop the drug trade without stopping the flow of commerce in our very technological commercial ports. It's impossible to stop the flow of money laundering without disrupting the work of the normal, let's call it normal financial activities of the world. So like cancer, as much as this metaphor has been abused, they are taking advantage of, it's been something that the Italian prosecutor has said a lot. We tend to think about criminal economy as being in contrast with legal economy, because we think of their initial activities such as extortion and you know, like we think them as a weight on the flow of normal economy. And this was very true at the beginning of their activities and where they created their power. Like in the small towns of Sicily or Calabria, they definitely weighted down the healthy development of society. But this is no longer true, and it hasn't been true anymore for decades, especially since they went global. And now it is recognized that criminal economies is absolutely synergic with normal economy, and this makes it harder to spot, harder to investigate, but mostly harder to stop. So I will leave some of the tips of how we work to Cecilia. This is just an introduction. But, you know, you can call me in if you need anything else. And, yeah, please.
Do I move like this? So, as you see in this picture, here we were in one of the Carabinieri police stations in Calabria, and there is a lot of court records back then. And one of the questions that we get a lot from colleagues, even last night we were on the board and I was asking for help, like which kind of tips you think might be relevant today. It's also how do you get information on the Italian Mafia. So we put these tips together. The first thing that you have to keep in mind with Italian Mafias is that they're family-based. Now, some of them are more family-based nowadays than others. The Cosa Nostra has been flagged as bastard lately because basically, especially in the United States, they started to do mixed weddings, they started to accept culprits from other criminal groups or other nationalities to come in, and that made it easier for the police to infiltrate them and knock hard on them. But especially the Calabrian Mafia, it's absolutely family-based, which means for our police that it's almost impossible to infiltrate them. Because how do you convince some mother that you're the seventh son? So the way the anti-mafia in Italy works on against the 'ndrangheta is very much old-fashioned, and they try to follow the structures, they try to follow the money. They know that more or less there are always certain criminal patterns. Even like recently, one of the main narcos, that he was been a fugitive for 2 years, wandering around Northern Europe. He even had a legitimate passport, and he was flying freely from Europe to Latin America. And the only way, obviously not on his real name, and the only way they managed to get him in the end, it was through family. Because at one point, his kids spoke in a wiretap and they used his nickname. I mean, the story is a bit more complex, but just to give you the idea that basically in the end, the only sort of very strong, but at the same time very weak point is the family. So usually what we do is we try to, and we've been doing this for some years, so now those drawings are growing a lot, but we have like maps. We map them and we do like Excel with date of birth, place of birth. I think at the end is like sort of similar to what cops have. And we try to monitor weddings as well, because in the, especially in the Calabrian Mafia, the weddings are very important. They're not random. They're usually chosen among clans to strengthen the relations. So for example, one very recent thing, I mean, colorful experience we were shared by cops is that they were trying to get a fugitive and they had to infiltrate a wedding. But usually it's impossible because everybody know each other, but in this specific case, it was two families from two different sides of Calabria, and not everybody knew the other people, so they managed to put a couple, like a female and a male cop, in this wedding. But obviously they had to dress them up proper, which meant a lot of stylistic job to get them to fit the wedding. And but this is, you have to think that this is really rare. Like usually you would not manage to infiltrate. So the type of work that police does, but also we as reporters try to do, is to trace their money and their assets. And we believe that in countries that don't have the anti-mafia legislation, like Germany, a lot of Europe, it would be interesting, especially for journalists, to try and do that, because you don't get to see that information. I mean, the prosecution really doesn't go for those assets because you don't have the mafia type association crime. So as a tip, start looking at their properties, their assets in general, cars, and map them. You might not be able to say initially that they're mafia, but maybe, maybe you can email us and we can see if from Italy we can prove that they're actually linked to a mafia type association, and you've got an investigation. Also, it's very important, the networks. Usually, even if some people get arrested, the network still stays in place. The structure of the clan stay in place. So it's very important. Usually the corrupted politicians or relation to certain parties, banks, different type of official, customs, will always be there. So if a corrupted custom from Hamburg is arrested, they surely have more than one. So it's not like, oh, he got arrested, they're not gonna have a person in there anymore. It's always there. So look at the structures and the sort of, let's say, patterns. Well, this is a mafia asset. It's a villa of a boss, you would not tell, but inside it was completely made of marble and gold. This is one of the Carabinieri action in one of the strongholds in Calabria. It's called San Luca. And these guys dress like military, they're still Carabinieri, and they're called the hunters, and they look for fugitives. Very briefly, in Italy, judicial records, they're not public. Meaning, you can get verdicts, they're public, but you have to request them in court. You can, usually should go there in person and do a request, and the judge can still say no for any reason. Most times, the judge says yes, so you get a verdict. But if you try to do it from abroad or from a different city without going there, sometimes phones ring forever, and it's very frustrating. All the other records are not really public information that you just get by ringing an office or going there. So you need to have sort of, I mean, the law is weird. Like, they are public, journalists can get them, but not through a request like that. So you need to have, like, to show the judiciary that you're a trustable journalist, you're not gonna ruin their investigation. Obviously, these are all records that are released after the investigation, so not during the investigation. But still, it's a bit like, so there is a lot of personal work that you have to do. And assets, companies, you can get a lot of information from a company registry, better than a lot of other places in the world, but you have to pay. It's actually quite costly. It's 11 euros to get a full company record, like historical. Well, I mean, we don't have time to go through all these, I guess, but again, patterns are very important, especially our brokers around the world sort of do all the same job, especially when they're in Latin America. We have been able in identifying with Latin American colleagues that our brokers move more or less always in the same way. They have relations with other criminal groups in the same way. So that's how we try to monitor it. And on the field reporting, being a woman and a man together helps because you look like a tourist couple. And we always rent different cars and never go with our own car. And well, we talk to the criminals at the end, although we don't do it during the field reporting, but we do it. And this is just a few pictures. We shot a documentary recently in the mafia tunnels. Basically, in the villages in Calabria, there is like an underground city. And this is us. This is one of the bunkers. It took us a few hours to get to this place underground. And so my last tip is you have to be small.
Thank you for that, Cecilia and Giulio. We will talk more about the Italian Mafia later on. Yassin, you have also investigated a family, but a family that organizes maybe a little bit differently. And I'm looking forward to hear about that. I'm going to start your small presentation here.
So I'm using this one? Okay.
Yes.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I can't see anything. Ah, yeah, okay, good. I'll start my talk with a picture of the biggest gold coin in the world. It's called the Big Maple Leaf. Weighs around 100 kilogram. Well, I think exactly 100 kilogram. The material worth of the thing is 3.75 million euros. There's only 6 of these in the world. One of them was on display in Berlin, and in March 2017 it was stolen out of a museum. That in itself should have been reason enough for us to try and investigate, because that's pretty interesting. How do I, this one? The arrow, sorry. Oh, yeah, okay, that's fine too. But the story became more interesting after surveillance images appeared of these 3 gentlemen who were pretty quickly identified by the police in Berlin as members of one family, 2 brothers and their cousin. I'm not going to name the family for several reasons, but it is one of those families that we've been having a bit of a problem with in Germany over the past few decades. And there's no good term really to apply here. In Germany, most people will talk about criminal Lebanese clans. I'm not sure that's a great term at all. And what is true is that these families trace back to Lebanon. Most of them came in the 80s to Germany. But I don't think you can call a family a criminal enterprise, or you should. But it is true that we do have around half a dozen of these families who are rather large, hundreds of members, and a lot of members, male members especially, of these families are known by the police because they committed many, many crimes. In the case of this particular family, I think the police recorded 1,100 crimes by members of the family in the course of 9 years, and they're assessed to be around 150 only, so it's one of the smaller families. But among the crimes that they attribute to members of these families were pretty spectacular ones. They robbed a jewelry store, they broke into a bank, they stole, well, the court case is still ongoing, so they allegedly stole the Big Maple Leaf. And the police believes that members of this family alone made around 17.5 million euros in the past 10 years. So that's a ton of money. The problem is they never find the money. So sometimes they can put these guys on trial and they will sentence them, but the money is gone. And in this case, the coin is gone. The theory is, the assumption is that it was melted for the gold and that it was smuggled outside the country and sold for its plain worth in gold, in weight. So what we did when we started, after we decided that we wanted to investigate this whole case, and we had been reporting on these families before, so we had a bit of an idea, we started to follow the money, or we decided that we would finally follow up on a couple of tips that we'd received earlier, namely that, in particular, this family has been buying up real estate in Berlin. So that's a classical way, I guess, of money laundering, of trying to turn criminal booty into seemingly legitimate money, and I'm sure it's the same way in Italy. And what we did find out was that roughly 70 units, among them flats, entire buildings, apartments, you name it, are registered in the name of members of this family. This is astonishing because most of the members of this family live on social welfare. So there's no real way to imagine how they can buy buildings and flats in Berlin. And then we sent one of our colleagues to the courthouse in one of the most afflicted areas of Berlin, where all the property documents are stored, the records. And he basically spent 3 weeks in the basement there. And what turned out very interestingly is that many of these units of real estate are being held by a woman in Berlin on behalf of another woman in Lebanon. So we got a Lebanese citizen who gave power of attorney to a Lebanese woman in Berlin. And the problem is that the Lebanese woman in Beirut, who owns millions of euros worth of real estate in the middle of Berlin, doesn't have a proper address. So she got this document that she gave away power of attorney with, acknowledged by the German embassy in Beirut, but the document is it's not complete at all. You can't find her with with the information that she gave the German embassy, it's impossible to find her. I mean, I went to Beirut and tried to look for her and her lawyer, and the only address that they had was a part of town of Beirut. So you can't find somebody if all you have is the name of a quarter, So that was kind of interesting and shouldn't have happened, but that made it really complicated for us. So as I said, I went to Beirut also, and that's one of the other challenges that I would like to speak about a little more later, also because this is, we're talking about families. So there's social life going on. There's, there's more to, it's more than a story about a criminal organization. It also makes it very difficult to write about, the culprits, the bad guys, because maybe 90% of the family are not involved in criminal activity at all. We wouldn't even know. We don't know how many they are. It's very hard if you find a piece of real estate registered in the name of the cousin of the guy to make the connection. I mean, you could do it if it was a criminal organization, but if it's a family, it's very difficult to do that. So those are challenges for us as journalists that we have to deal with all the time. So, for example, when I was in Beirut, I found this club. Where it's a social club where most of these families, they've got shared history, they know each other, where they have social functions. So I smuggled myself in there for a funeral, and it was very interesting. There were about 200, 250 guys there, and I'd say 50, maybe 100 of them had just traveled in from Berlin in the morning, and we're going back the next day. So the connections are very tight, but it's very difficult to prove something. Anyway, so what happened in this case is that, we wrote a rather large report in our paper. It's a 3-page spec. I brought you this because I like the design. If you see the golden line, that's the original size of the gold coin that was stolen. So we wrote this piece, and a week, or I think it was a week after we published the piece, German police, or Berlin police rather, raided 77 units of real estate of that family, citing our report in their warrants, which I didn't think was such a great idea. They didn't ask, they did it anyway. And they have been they confiscated these buildings under a new German legislation, which we basically stole from Italy as an idea, to go after organizations like this. And the core of the idea of this new legislation is that you can confiscate stuff if you have proper reason to believe that the money cannot come from anywhere else but criminal activity, but you don't have to prove what criminal act. So that's the new idea behind it. Anyway, so a year later we wrote another piece to, and this is just to show you that we are trying to follow up on this. So, every 6 months, every 12 months, we will come up with a new piece. And, well, we've been focusing on this family a lot now, so there are other families that we will be focusing on later. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Yassin, for that. Now, Karen, you have a whole other perspective than we do in some ways, because you have the full force of the law behind you. Talk us through some of your experiences working for the FBI investigating criminal networks.
So is this on? Can everybody hear me back there? Wave your hand. Hello? Yeah, so I'll give you like 2 minutes of my own personal history so you understand how I come to all of this. So I'm a lawyer. Don't hold that against me. But I think you also have some good feelings about lawyers, maybe. I first had my first source into an organized crime network in 1991 when I lived in Russia. After I just changed over from the Soviet Union, I flew in the day before. I thought it was a great idea. I've regretted it ever since. No, I'm kidding. And I was not in the FBI, and I didn't know anything about developing sources, but I developed as a source a young woman who worked for a Russian organized crime group. The guy that she worked for actually styled himself after Al Pacino, if you remember Al Pacino in the Godfather's movies, Scarface. He had just gotten out of prison. I didn't know that until much later. In Latvia, he had murdered somebody and he had been in jail, and he and his brother got out. And of course, I'm completely ignorant as to we knew nothing about organized crime from the former Soviet Union. At that time, what was going on in the United States, what we were starting to see in New York was, as part of some of the good emigres who had come to the United States, you had criminal networks that had started to infiltrate, emigre networks, and they were committing murders, and they were committing all kinds of stuff in the emigre communities, that were from the former Soviet Union. I talked to this guy. I went to a typical mob meeting, where he had bought out the entire restaurant because he wanted to talk with a guy that he was in his pocket who was the head of a bits factory in St. Petersburg, Russia, and that was my introduction to organized crime. Fast forward a few years later, when I was in the FBI, I joined in 1996. Those individuals actually came up again. They were in the United States. They were going to kidnap my former boss. In the United States, they were going to kidnap my former boss, who I'd worked for in St. Petersburg. And because I remembered the names, I had taken the information and coordinated with the FBI agents who had the case, because he was not in where I was working. And we got that guy arrested and deported. It turned out, while he was talking to me, he was stealing from the city of St. Petersburg $9.5 million, which was a lot of money in 1991 for the city of St. Petersburg, which at that point, Vladimir Putin, who was the deputy mayor, was telling everybody that they were actually, in a crisis, that they couldn't get food. So that was his excuse to organize the sale of timber, which was supposed to supply food to the city of St. Petersburg, which actually bought him a residence in Mallorca, Spain. So that was my first experience. And so I get into the FBI, and I speak, Russian kind of, and they send me to an office near New York. We had the spillover from organized crime, again, as I'm saying, coming out everywhere into our businesses, into our communities, and so I started working organized crime at that point. Over the years, I've done our Cosa Nostra, which of course is called La Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours. The last big case that I did was organized crime, La Cosa Nostra involvement in the garbage industry, which just goes to show you that organized crime has no shame as to what they will get involved with, but it was a multi-million-dollar industry for them, and I would joke that we actually seized 27 garbage companies. One of them was actually called FBI. So we seized our own garbage company back, just kidding. But my point in talking about this is, a number of years ago, I transferred then to our FBI headquarters, where I worked transnational organized crime, and we were trying to explain to people that La Cosa Nostra wasn't the beginning and end of organized crime in the United States. It never had been. And one of the arguments that we would constantly get into is this question about organizational structure. Does it have to be La Cosa Nostra, where we knew every single member, and that they had given themselves a name, and that we could put them all on an org chart? And the answer is no. We don't, unfortunately, in the United States have the Criminal Association Law. Our law is called the Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization Act, or RICO for short. It was passed in the 1960s. But the nice thing about our racketeering law is that I don't have to give you the name of an organization. It is a factual-based investigative tool, and it also has with it a provision for seizure of assets, criminal assets, so we can indict the asset, so like those 77 properties, and we take those 77 properties. So what I started to explain to people is networks like, this one that you're talking about, networks that were coming in other ways, which might have brought with them a structure. Like, for example, Chinese triads and tongs. We had all kinds of kidnappings in the 1990s in the United States, where China, again, with all of the good emigres, came in organized crime, and they were committing crimes within their communities, which were also difficult to infiltrate, when you didn't have, individuals who were a part of those communities or were from particular part of China. And so what I started to talk to people, and I started to point out to people, is Organizational structure may often be built by the facts, which is what you were talking about, and not in a definitive structure, like the Italian Mafia organizations, which I've also worked with Italy on investigating some of those organizations. And so what the other point I would, when I would talk to people about, particularly from the former Soviet Union, is, the impression was that from the former Soviet Union, that those organizations were newer, that they, had new policies. And I said, you have to understand that when we're talking about organizations like the Italian Mafia, the Chinese triads and tongs, and organized crime from the former Soviet Union, you are talking about the fact of, you are looking at organizations that have survived multiple changes of government, sometimes over hundreds of years. And so when you are looking sometimes in a community, at the structure of organized crime, sometimes that structure of organized crime has been better, has been more adaptive and long-running and more committed to the community itself and making its living off the community itself than the local government. And so, and of course, what has happened with a number of these organizations, that of course what goes with the criminal structure and infiltrating, or being a part of the community is, of course, the corruption of government. And so tomorrow's panel will talk to you about the corruption of government side. But on this point, in organized crime, when, the first thing that you have to come down to is you have to forget to look for a named organization that you're looking at, because you may not have it. What you may have is a criminal structure built out of the facts. And that's what you and I, as an investigator from the FBI, would look at. And once I started to get that point across to people, we still had a lot of trouble with European police, other police departments, because they just kept saying, well, it doesn't have a name. Or we'd get people get very angry at me because you say, well, you keep calling them this one ethnic group. And I'm like, I don't have any other way to describe the fact that every member of this organization comes from the same town and is of the same ethnicity. So to me, what the most important thing is, number one is, even as an investigator from the FBI, the way criminal structures have evolved over the last 25 or 30 years, they have been able to adapt to globalization far better than a lot of other places have. And so you can't say anymore necessarily that they function, at least on paper, the way they did 25 or 30 years ago. But that doesn't mean that they aren't still, there isn't still an organization behind it that you need to look for. So that was the point that I would have to get across to FBI, to all of our investigators as well, is stop looking for the org chart that you can put out there that has a name on it. The second point I think you have to make is, the point that I just made a little bit, and that is globalization has changed the way that they move money around. It's made it a lot easier. It's made it easier to buy your citizenship from somebody else, for $150,000 and move on a legitimate passport. And so a global problem, which is what I call transnational organized crime, requires a global response. And what we're seeing now is that law enforcement has been very slow, and countries have been very slow to pass the laws to address this as a global problem. Fortunately, I'm very happy to hear that Germany has passed that law, because you get into conversations with German, investigators 10, 15 years ago even, 5 years ago, and they would say, no, it's the crime. We're gonna prioritize our assets towards investigating the crime. And I'm like, crime is committed by people. And if you're looking for the heroin trafficking network, and that's all you're looking for, the heroin trafficking network has all kinds of other things that they're doing, including laundering money. So my point to you is this, is law enforcement it has a lot of tools in its box, but it's also limited as to the way governments look at organized crime. And our governments have been very slow in recognizing that organized crime is moving and changing faster than they can keep the laws in the books in order to address it. So you as the investigative journalist, when you're doing the reporting that you're doing, understand that the important part of what you're doing in organized crime is giving us an idea of the way this network is working now, and then you can give it to law enforcement and they can take all the credit for it.
Thank you for that, Karen. And another reason, obviously, that some of these families or criminal networks has survived is because they have connections high up in the governments, right? Stefan, go ahead and talk a little bit about what you do. Sure, sure. Yeah, just take that out. And while he plugs that in, I could just tell you that right after this, in the same room, we will have a networking session for all of you who are interested in cooperating with others in this room about criminal networks. So please stay for those of you who are interested in that. In a few minutes, we're also going to open up a little bit more for your question, and I'm going to ask you guys some questions from up here. That's all the time you got.
Okay, I'm just saying, where's the... Is it? Cool. Okay, is my mic working? Right, okay, so I'll tell you now one very crazy story, but it's true story. Let me, where do I... Yeah, it's, I don't know, like, so start from this one.
This one?
Okay, so, we're waiting for guys to, okay, so these two guys who are funny dressed in these colorful shirts, actually they were, on the guy in the red shirt was the leader of one organized crime group from Serbia that was engaged in drug smuggling and a lot of murders, very notorious group. Next to him in a black shirt is his top hitman. And this guy is really like psychopathic serial killer. And this group is actually important for one reason, because they did something pretty brutal. They killed our prime minister in 2003. So this is not such a long history. And it's not so far away from here. It's like less than 2 hours flight to get to the Belgrade. And we are the country where actually organized crime team up with Secret Service in 2003, and they killed the prime minister with a sniper shot. Okay, but this is not actually the most bizarre part of the story. Now it's coming. So after they killed prime minister, finally the state organized and made one big police operation when they swept the underworld. So they dismantled this gang. This gang doesn't exist anymore. They killed, the cops killed this guy and his right-hand man. And they put on trial some people from Secret Service and from organized crime. They didn't manage to really get everyone, but the guy on this other photo it was the most important protected witness in the case. So there was a couple of protected witnesses who were part of the gang who explained how the gang was operating. So after the whole trial is finished, as always, not all of these people were arrested who are participating in this gang. Okay, so when you analyze what this protected witness was saying in the court, was the most interesting things that we found in his testimony is that he talked about this guy so this in red, if you recognize, is the leader of the gang, and next to him was one young doctor. And this photo was taken in 2001. And this was really, really interesting story, because protected witness gave names a lot of people who were involved with the gang in money laundering, lawyers, wherever. But we got interested in this guy because he was a doctor working in an emergency clinic. So his job was actually when the gang shoot somebody on the street, but this person survived, he didn't die. They hire him, and then he go and kill him inside of the hospital, because usually the police put the people in front of the doors, so he as a doctor was able to really get inside. And the protected witness explained one case which he personally testified, which he personally was involved, when one Montenegrin criminal was ended in hospital. And then this doctor was in the headquarters of this criminal organization when they discussed that they want this guy to really get to be dead. And then this doctor said, okay, I will do it. And then after a few hours, basically he came back and said that he put some injection into his insulin, and then guy really died tomorrow. Okay. So anyway, you know, to publish this story, we want to have some more evidence, not just testimony of the protected witness, right? So we analyzed more what they were saying. So we were interested, okay, what this guy is getting from the gang. So basically, for this particular murder, they awarded him with one real estate. So he got one apartment, not in the center of the Belgrade, but it was pretty nice location. Okay, so we were like, okay, so let's try to prove that there was really transaction, actually that this doctor really got apartment from the gang, which was not so easy, but we'll not now go into techniques of you know, investigative reporting. All of you know how to do it well. Basically, we really managed to find that, how we go, it's like, so this is the building where we managed to find that this apartment really existed, and we managed to get even the contract between the wife of that hitman and the doctor, which we use actually to prove that there was really transaction of apartment and the detail, and there was like actually besides this one, there was another protected witness who also gave in detail, he told where the apartment was located, so we were able really to show that these people were not telling lies. So that this doctor really got apartment in return for the murder, okay. But actually, the most bizarre part of the story is coming now, so this was nothing actually. And what makes this story special is that this doctor today is no less than a Serbian Minister of the Health. No, it's really, so this guy is Minister of the Health. And what is the weirdest? We published story. We published this story 2 years ago. Then we have another story who exposed in more details his connection to this group. And we even won like awards for this story, and this guy was reappointed. So, you know, you cannot touch him. So this may be funny, but actually it's very sad. And I'll just take, I don't know how much time I have. 2 minutes, very short. I'll really trying to briefly in 3 minutes tell the history of Balkan, not just Serbian organized crime, to really understand why these things are possible. And actually, many of the stories we do is not just investigating crime. Most of the story, unfortunately, we do is finding the criminals inside of the state structure. So just put on the so fastly. Let's say so. You know. Serbia was the part of Yugoslavia, like many other Balkans countries, right? And after Second World War, when the partisans won, you know, so we have the Tito, communist leader, a lot of people left Yugoslavia. So, and there was like big variety of these people. There were some dissidents, but also there were former Nazi collaborators. So everyone who was not on a partisan side basically left the country, and we got really huge wave of immigration of Serbs, Croats, Albanians all over the world, right? So the communists decided to kill a bunch of them as revenge, right? But they didn't want to get involved Secret Service to do it itself. So they decided to pick a lot of criminals who were part of our immigration around the world. But at that time, they were not organized crime groups. They were like small, petty criminals doing like burglaries, like robberies and this kind of stuff. So the deal was that the state officially made, I mean officially, unofficially, yes, the state made a deal with them that they kill some people and they will helping them when they get in problem, right? But the problem is these guys were not real killers, so they committed a couple really brutal and you know, bizarre acts. Like once in Chicago, they killed one Serbian immigrant. They stabbed him like 50 times with a knife and killed some 15-year-old girl that was with him. So this made a lot of attraction in the media and in the public. So the Secret Service was, okay, we need to train this guy how to kill. And then these criminals get really extensive, really good training from the Secret Service how really to kill, but not just how to kill, also they got trainings in surveillance and counter-surveillance. And they become actually criminals with pretty good tools and knowledge, right? And they use these knowledge actually to take over a lot of capitals around Europe. So as you know, in many, like in Sweden, here in Germany, you have the towns when basically Balkan organized crime was Serbs, Montenegrins, Albanians are controlling. So, but the problem next is that basically we don't have, like in Italy, we don't have organic organized crime that just, organically appeared. Our organized crime was actually produced and created by the state. And this is the reason why basically this connection between organized crime and the state in Balkan, even today, they were never actually cut it, So we don't have it's not like cops going after mafia, it's more the nexus of it. And that's, I hope I managed to finish on time, right?
Thank you, Stevan, for that. Thank you. Thank you for that brief window into Balkan history and that horrific presentation of yours. Thank you. I'm going to open up for some questions from you guys as well. Please raise your hand. I'm going to ask a few questions to them first, so don't raise your hand yet. But I was wondering, Karen, and also Stevan, but Karen, in your line of work, what are some of the red flags that make you feel like, okay, this is not a story for you, but this is a start of a criminal investigation? What are some of the red flags that get you started?
I'm going to eat the microphone, I guess. So, of course, the easiest one, and believe it or not, I have had people come to me and tell me that, hey, there's this organized crime group in your area who's doing crime X, Y, and Z. It happens every once in a while. You get that lucky. And obviously, if it's somebody that I think is a source that I can vet out their information, that's going to be red flag number one. Number two is, and I've done this many times, and I've taught my agents how to do this. I ran a squad of what we called non-traditional organized crime investigators in Chicago. If you have a person, which we have caught, let's say, for example, we had an individual who had clearly had, Soviet criminal tattoos. And he's got them all over his body, and we take a bunch of pictures, we take the pictures, the local cops take pictures when they arrest him, send it to us. And so I start looking at this individual and saying, okay, what else do we know about him? Has he associated with anybody else that's in our databases? Are we seeing about him now social media connections? Because usually criminal networks work on, individuals who have some sort of history with each other. Personal history, family history, and so they're going to go to their guy, and 90% of the time it is a guy, to when they want to commit other crimes. And sometimes the only thing I get is 3 people arrested in a car in a traffic stop together. And then I look at those people. So that would be red flag number 2. Does this guy have associations who are clear, who we either know or we think are a part of a criminal network? And then the third thing is that what is the allegation? What am I looking at in terms of the crime? I mean, if it's a crime that one guy is not going to be able to commit by himself, or maybe with a friend, looking through corporate structures nowadays, for money laundering, associations, things like that. So I say the third thing is what kind of crime am I looking at, and is it a crime that would require multiple people or multiple players who have maybe even different job roles to do what they're doing?
Thank you for that. Cecilia and Giulio, these kinds of investigations get some of them get really, really big. You get a lot of documents, a lot of sources. How do you guys work to structure your investigation, especially since you guys don't work at the same place?
But some of these investigations, we're getting better at it. We follow them for a lot of years. Like, for example, on the drug trafficking, we've been working for 7 years on the same groups, and now we start to know the people, the companies, the structures quite well, but we don't wait to get to the end of the investigation to publish. We sort of try to slice it in chunks. that's one, it's more like editorial kind of strategy, but then internally we try to organize the records. A lot of the police records that we get have a lot of information that are not relevant for in court, I mean to prove, but there are tips to go and further investigate. So we try to take some time, as we don't do news reporting, we don't really need to like write the day after one arrest, so we take our time and we talk to colleagues from around the world. So if there is a hint on Colombia or in Germany, we work with colleagues on that tip and try to analyze it and stock information on that for some time. And then, well, for example, we work in the OCCRP network, so it's very useful to be able and check information against databases of the investigative dashboard, for example. And what else can we add?
I don't know. It's true that it's an infinite work. Like it really never ends because the people change. You, as Cecilia was saying before, you track the marriage, and then a whole new family that was maybe not, or at least we didn't know was part of the Mafia Association or wanted to be part of the Mafia Association, becomes a new center of attention. Like we had a case in the Netherlands where they were importing a lot of cocaine through the flower market, and as soon as the guys got arrested, we noticed that the daughter of one of these guys married another guy that worked as a plumber, and all of a sudden this plumber opens up a flower company in Calabria. So like, okay, we add him to the list, and we're starting to have very long lists, and we have very important archives of all of our documents. And as Cecilia was saying, all of a sudden there is a chunk of this relations, investigations, facts, and informations that is contained enough to be presented as a story, but that doesn't mean that we just keep on updating our databases, talking to colleagues, enlarging our network as much as we can. That's why we're here, by the way. Like we work with Stevan, we work with Nathan, we work with a lot of people in this room who are very much experts in their local organized crime, and we exchange information, of course, and we will get to that as much as we can in a secure way, and we try to take care of each other as much as we can. But then, of course, it is and it will always be an endless job because they survive centuries, and so like we kind of need to do the same.
Maybe just very briefly, as you asked, how do we do it from far? I mean, well, obviously, among ourselves within ERP, we're far away, like different cities, but also we work with colleagues from all over the world. But then we do field work together, which might mean field work in Italy, or like we do meetings in person, or we actually go to like Calabria, Sicilia, or
Never
Milan.
alone? Never alone? Field work?
Sometimes, but when we go alone, we work with a local colleague. So never one person alone wandering. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'd have somebody always like one or more than one desk following us. Even like when we were in Malta, it was two of us, but then two editors following and one reporter, so like different desks, yeah.
Can you say, like, sometimes when you investigate these networks, these transnational networks, you really got stuck with so many information and you lose yourself. So actually to finish it, you need to have some fresh eyes and some good editor, actually. That's what takes. Now, actually, I don't know if Jim, my editor Jim is now here, but now with him I'm trying to finish some story that I even forgot it. I think it started in 2011. You know, the first FOIA request I found like for 2011. So there was some organized crime group investigate, which I got so stuck. So like, you know, it's kind of cool. So we have new editor who basically jumped to finish the story, and I'm hoping now we can finish it because really it's so much data. I don't know, like if you just put Excels with the names of the people, sometimes it will be like tens of thousands names, and you got.
All right, Yassin, you were talking a lot about what follow the money actually means. I guess that was a lot of what the work you did following these transactions. Can you tell me a little bit more about what does follow the money actually means? Because we hear it all the time.
I believe you guys are, you know, probably more experienced in that particular field than I am. But in our case, it meant, I mean, the breakthrough for us really was going to the property records and seeing the same name coming up of a person who, you know, we didn't even know if she existed or not. But it was kind of clear even for us that this is probably a straw man or woman in that case. And then we went to Beirut, and the problem is in Beirut we didn't get any further. And what we realized later, I mean, we were working in parallel with the police, not knowing of one each other's, just to make that clear, we never give, we only take of each other's work. But what we realized when they, after they confiscated those and seized those properties, and we got to take a look into their investigation, was that they were working on the very same thing. They had the same document in front of them. They didn't know who she was. They had one advantage over us. They could call up Lebanese police, and they tracked her down, and they interrogated her on behalf of the Germans, or interviewed her, didn't interrogate her. And that is something that we couldn't do. But following the money, I mean, you know, in this case it was honestly, it's more fascinating than it is difficult, because we got 17 million lacking, and people buying houses who are on social welfare, you know, it's not that difficult, you know it, you know. The problem is proving it, and in this case we didn't have any bank accounts, or, you know, what usually comes up in these kinds of investigations. So it was a lot of legwork, and we're really, to be honest, we're looking for hints. We're looking for indications. We knew we wouldn't find conclusive evidence in the form of data, not in this kind of investigation.
Mm-hmm. And my last question before we open up to the audience, Stefan and maybe Giulio and Cecilia, how do you guys keep yourself and your sources safe when working with these, what did you call them, maniacs, psychos? No. Yeah.
This particular guy, I think he even has really officially some, you know, he's now in prison. Yeah, so I mean, security, it's pretty like, I mean, yesterday we talked for an hour and a half about security, and we didn't have enough time to talk about it. If I just talk about physical security, right? So it's really hard now to tell anything in 1 minute. But what is important, actually, we really, during the whole work, we're pretty much having a lot of time thinking and dealing with security. I think that's very important. And if I can put a couple of advisors or lessons, immediately will be like that the OCCRP have a really good approach, is that editor should be responsible for security, which is not in many newsrooms. So kind of editor is the one whose responsibility is actually to taking care for security of the reporters, and that's a good approach. So he's the one to be blamed if something happens, right? And a couple of other things is that we, when we deal with organized crime group, we really giving our best to make the profiles of these guys. You know, because some criminals kill, some not. Sometimes you'll have huge international organized crime group who eventually will not kill you, and then you can work stories on some football hooligans and they come kill you. So, you know, you cannot just, you know, give one prison. So we really, especially through sources, we try to really mentally learn what these guys are capable to do and what triggers them. That's very important. Sometimes they will be triggered if their families mention the story, you know, many different reasons. So, not to getting in details, but we're really trying to make profiles of these guys before the story is published. Then one more advice, let's say, will be never put too much focus on yourself. So I think that's very important lesson. So I think there should not be a story about organized crime with one journalist in byline, never, you know. Even if I will do alone some story, I'll add a couple of colleagues inside. So always, no, really, you always do as a group. So
that's never, not nice.
No, but what journalists usually do, they try and, I mean, kind of, they putting too much focus on themselves, like doing the story. They don't want to share, you know, story with others, giving lectures, training. So they kind of making themselves the target and making themselves that these criminals think, okay, so if we, you know, kill this guy, everything is gone. So it's better to think from the standpoint of view that, you know, it's group working, organization is behind you. So this guy, these guys should more think about that killing one person will not really stop the story. And this is what impression you also want to do to make through your work. Because, I mean, you know, for the most of organized crime, they don't just decide and send somebody to kill you. It's the whole process. In many cases, for 2 months, they will follow the target, the victim, and then kill him on the better spot. They need to invest some money. So still, they need to make some decision to order some hit, right? So in a way, how you investigate it and publish your story, you want to kind of make less possible chance they'll make this decision. Because when they make it, there's nothing much in this world can actually help you. If, you know, I can tell you later about some murders of some journalists, and you'll see that basically there's no possibility of surviving.
Very good, thank you, Stefan. We're going to open up for some questions. Our fantastic volunteers have microphones, and they will run to you as fast as they can. We had a question here, and then over there we have 2 questions. I have one specific question. Yes, just speak in it, they will put it on. They put it on? Yes, they will hear you.
Okay. In my country, at least, we have a lot of money, criminal money, ending in Dubai. And as well, we have some criminals that escape the police by immigrating to Dubai. I just wanted to hear, is that something you can recognize? Or?
It's full of them. Some of my obsession are in Dubai. They went there a long time ago, and one of the it's not what we would call concorso esterno. It's like the crime of external participation in mafia type association. These people are today one of the main strengths of Italian organized crime group. They're not explicitly part of the families, but they are specialists, normally money launderers or sometimes even traffickers. And one of these guys, a ship owner, has been the link between some 'Ndrangheta clans and the Minister of Interior, like, you know, the very top levels of the state. As soon as the indictment against him came out, he went to Dubai. He's there, happy and free. Like, yes, they're all there. It's a, I mean, big party. We should do a conference there and just like meet them.
Did you hear that, GIJN? Good. We had 2 questions over there. I think the lady in the back was first, right? Oh.
Yeah, coming back to source protection. So if people come to you also wanting to get out of the crime groups, do you guys have any advice? I've struggled with this, apart from finding a good lawyer and not wanting to go to the state. Yeah, advice on that. They want to leave the crime group.
I think, yeah, I think it really depends on your country. Some countries have pretty effective witness protection program that I would recommend. Some countries don't. In our case, in Italy, it's fairly good. We had sources that were like under it, and it has its limits because the resources of the state are limited. But I wouldn't know how to do it like DIY. I wouldn't try because you get an extreme responsibility in this case. So I would probably look for someone in another country that might be able to take care of it. These groups are global, so you can trace wherever they have activities, and it's likely that even if in your country there is nothing effective, that criminal organization has assets or interests in a country where they might get better protection, but maybe...
Yeah, that's a very hard question. I mean, I've had commitments like that to human beings before, and we do have a very, very, very effective witness protection program in the United States, but it is very hard to get into. But I would say it's just not a good idea to start making a commitment to another person's life when you don't have the resources or to be able to care for them. I agree. You need to find a country that does have a good witness protection program that would be interested in it. A lawyer could be an introduction to that. You know, but you know, I mean, it's very hard to say no, but if you don't have those resources to support someone like that, don't take that responsibility, because you know it's just going to break your heart and their heart when something happens, and it will happen.
All right, then we had one right there. Is there anyone else? Good.
I wanted to ask Karen, and maybe some others from the panel would like to respond, regarding best practice examples of cooperation between law enforcement or journalists. Are there systematic ways how to improve to make the system more effective in dealing with crime globally? So maybe some suggestions, what you see could be done to make it better.
So funny you should ask that question. That's what I'm here for. One of the things that I, learned over the years of doing my work in the FBI was, there was a lot of frustration either way. 20 years ago, the cooperation between law enforcement and journalists was much different. You could go talk to, investigators off the record, and in some respects you can still do that. But the problem is that, and I was just using this example today, a couple of years ago, we were approached by a media organization who wanted to talk to us about a particularly very, very high-profile subject. Under our rules, at the time that I was functioning under, I had to write a report of that meeting. And that report of that meeting had to be turned over to the subject's defense attorney when he was arrested. And the subject's defense attorney took that report and gave it to another news organization who tried to use that against me, the lawyers, the FBI, that we'd violated rules in the United States, we'd violated laws in the United States, to try to damage the prosecution of this very high-profile individual. So what I realized, though, is that you all are the frontline people in a lot of cases in talking to human beings that are either the victims of organized crime or participants in organized crime and have very, very good information. So how do you broach that? So what I've been doing with Transparency International and OCCRP for about the last 9 months since I've been out of the Bureau is trying to figure out how we can make that relationship better, which protects you as journalists and your sources, and doesn't get law enforcement into the position that they're in with accusations that they've co-opted journalists, they're cooperating with liberal media, and then of course a number of you work in countries where media is controlled by oligarchs, and controlled by the government. And so how do you go about talking to law enforcement? So that's one of the things that I do, and it's still a work in progress as to how to make that better. We've done a few things with TI and OCCRP, but that's something that I'm working on, is finding a way that protects both sides' interests.
I see Yassin is jumping up and down. Can I just ask a hard question to all of the journalists in the panel? Would you ever turn over information to the police that you haven't published?
Okay, to start.
Just by show of hands.
Well, no, I can't unconditionally raise my hand, but to start with that, I would do it if I had knowledge of an immediate terrorist attack to a house from now, obviously, or if I knew there's a body in a car somewhere, obviously. But also, I do it through my chief editor because that's what he gets paid for. But having said that, and having gotten that out of the way, I think I've got a real headache to even use the term cooperation in terms of law enforcement. It's something that my journalistic instincts are totally against. And I'll tell you why. In every single investigation we've done in the world of, in these clans, the investigators on the police side, on the side of law enforcement, are subjects of our research as well. It's also, every story is also about how do they handle the cases. And I have to keep my distance from them. I can't write about them while I cooperate with them. That's impossible. So this is why I said very consciously, we only take, we never give. So we will meet with these people unofficially, unauthorized, we'll try to get them to talk, we'll try to get information out of them, and we will not cooperate with them, we will not give them anything back in return.
I heard Cecilia squeak a little bit when you said that. What did you want to say?
So let's say that our situation has been more complex. Just to give you one case, is not an organized crime. But we, and there are other people in the room who are working on this case as basically 6 years ago, we were contacted by a bunch of girls who told us, they were all foreigners, very young, and who told us, we have been drugged and raped by a cop in Italy. And what to do with it, short story is, we brought all the evidence to court, and we ended up being witnesses in court, but then also at the same time, we ended up following the case as journalists for 6 years. It's not a manual, it's not, but sometimes, and also, for example, we've been working on complex cases like the murder of colleagues as journalists over the last 2 years. And I mean, you are heard as witness, you are still reporting as journalists. So I think you have to work on like a very thin equilibrium between some of the cops can become your off-the-record sources, but also you have to think, how do you protect that? Not everything can be put in a written a police report because you don't really know who's going to handle that. You cannot trust all prosecutors, even in the anti-mafia. But then at the same time, I don't think that this, no, we're not talking to them at all works.
No, but that's explicitly not what I've been saying. We talked to them a lot. And also, let me clarify, if I may. It's just the term cooperation that I don't like. And I think your work is great. We spoke about it earlier. I think it is important that journalists know better, understand better how investigators work, for example. That's very, very helpful and important. But cooperation is something that is a term that I would not want to use. Yeah.
All right, we have time for one last question. Over there.
Me in the blue? Okay. So I want to thank Yasser. In 2013, I did a cover story for Newsweek on how my own relatives were going into jihadi networks, and you helped. Thank you for that. Collaboration is the key, I think, in a lot of investigative journalism. The question I have is, just on that subject, how much does ideology play into these criminal networks, whether it's white supremacists or jihadists, or even like sort of the mafia in Italy?
Want to start?
Well, it connects to what I wanted to say before, so I might start. The mafia has a very strong sort of ideology, although it's not perfectly out in the open, it is not definable. It's more of a culture than an ideology. It's not an adherence to a code, although they have a code for themselves. But and it's part of the reason why prosecutor and law enforcement in Italy are amongst the most open in every country, because they realized pretty quickly that the fight against mafia is mostly a cultural fight, and so they had to make clear what they were doing and why and how, and what they were up against. And so like the help of journalists in the civil fight against organized crime in Italy that is so pervasive meant it that, of course, they wanted to get their work out in the open, and of course they talk. But yeah, the top mafia, the top 'ndrangheta boss of 2010, when he was discovered in the most important operation against 'ndrangheta, the Crimine investigation, Domenico Pedisano, he was like the final judge of any controversy inside one of the most powerful criminal gangs in the world. He lived in a hut in the countryside with a couple of sheep and barely electricity. And how do they do that? It's not uncommon that lower-ranking mafia members are proud to go to jail to defend their boss. You could not possibly have such a strong structure without a strong ideology, strong adherence to a code, and the culture of mafia and their rituals, their music. I mean, all organized crime groups have that, and that's how they are loyal to one another. So it's important to describe it. It's important to keep it in mind. It helps you define where the group ends, because it ends where this culture ends very often, and sometimes it ends after it. But like that's the very least.
I think it's also, and I mean, jihadist networks are an entirely different thing, and I'm happy to discuss it with you, but I'm not sure this is the best place. But there's one thing I wanted to add to these Arabic or Lebanese clans that we are seeing in Germany and all across Europe, really, is this is what I find very, very important when reporting on them, is to take into consideration the fact that they have a shared history that goes back over 100 years. There's a common experience in this family, experiences that are being passed on from father to son, from mother to daughter, and so on. And they are super important because they explain a lot of their behavior. In this particular case, these clans, they all come from a cluster of villages in what is today Turkey. They left there because they were super poor. They went to Beirut. They didn't make it there. They worked shit jobs. They never got proper documentation. And they were always treated badly. And they were very uneducated. In the history of these families, they never had the experience that any state is somebody you can trust. The only thing that you can trust in their historical experience is the family. And that explains why there's nobody who will rat out his relatives, why there's nobody who will ask his cousin, you know, why are you doing that? And that is a very, very important dimension.
Okay, can I say, so, what's interesting, like, Balkan is, let's say, bunch of small countries that are arguing between each other. So there's like a lot of tension, you know, Serbia, Albania, Kosovo, Croatia, Bosnia. So if you follow like daily politics in Balkan, it's, you know, big tension, arguments, fights between countries. But then you look some Balkan organized crime group in South America, and then you're happy to see that the group consists of all people from Balkans. So, you know, one group will have like Serbs, Montenegrins, Albanians, all working together. You know, even usually in the, they don't even call them Serbians, Montenegrins. Usually in Europe, South America, they call it Yugo Mafia, like former Yugoslavia, because basically they all work together. So yes, I think at least from Balkan organized crime is kind of step ahead. So for them, they don't really recognize borders and like nationalism in a way that they really can easily cooperate with each other. So just the business is what is matter.
And so do we have to do to tackle these entities, I guess. Thank you so much, all of you guys, for this wonderful panel.